Welcome to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today's story isn't about vaults or super mutants or the usual wasteland horrors. It's about something worse, something real that happened before the bombs fell. We're exploring what America did to Canada, the annexation that the history books barely mention, the war crime that everyone in the wasteland seems to have forgotten. This is a confession from someone who was there, who saw it, who participated in it, a soldier's testimony about the 7 years of occupation, the systematic destruction of an entire nation, and the atrocities committed in the name of American security. It's disturbing, it's brutal, and every detail is pulled directly from verified Fallout lore. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. This entire script is narrated from the first-person perspective of a character from the Fallout universe. Their identity remains hidden throughout the story. After you've heard everything, try to guess which character is speaking in the comments below. The first person to guess correctly will have their comment pinned. I wore the stars and stripes on my power armor when I executed that family in Vancouver, and I remember their faces every single night. The history books call it annexation, but I was there. It was genocide wrapped in patriotism and broadcast on national television. They gave me a medal for what we did in Toronto, and I threw it into Lake Ontario along with my rifle and any shred of honor I had left. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you understand what really happened to Canada between 2069 and 2076. What matters is that someone finally tells the truth about America's most covered-up war crime, because the footage they showed you on Galaxy News Network was propaganda. The executions you saw were real, but they only showed you a fraction of what we did up there. I was 22 when I deployed to British Columbia in late 2069. Fresh out of boot camp, crew cut still tight, believing every word they fed us about protecting the pipeline and securing American interests. The recruiting officer told me I'd be a hero. He told me we were helping our Canadian allies maintain order during a difficult time. He didn't tell me I'd spend the next 7 years murdering civilians and calling it peacekeeping. The Anchorage front line had been established 10 years earlier, back in 2059, when we started fortifying Alaska against Chinese threats. Our oil fields up there were the last major reserves on the continent, and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline ran right through Canadian territory. At first, it was just diplomatic pressure. Let us station troops to guard the pipeline. Let our aircraft use your airspace. Standard stuff between allies, or so they told us. But Canada was reluctant. Their government knew what we really wanted: not cooperation, control, total, absolute control over every natural resource between the Yukon and the Great Lakes. By the time I arrived in 2069, that reluctance had turned into open resistance, and our orders had changed from protection to suppression. The first thing that hit me when we crossed into British Columbia wasn't the landscape or the cold. It was the smell. Vast stretches of timberland had been clear-cut for months, entire forests reduced to stumps and mud. The logging operations ran 24 hours a day, massive machines grinding through centuries-old trees to fuel the war effort against China. We weren't just taking their resources, we were erasing their country one forest at a time. They called Canada Little America by then. Most folks back home didn't even consider it a separate nation anymore, just the big 51st, waiting to be officially claimed. I remember seeing a Capital Post headline in the mess hall, some survey saying 90% of Americans thought Canada had already given up its sovereignty when they let our troops cross the border. That's what they wanted you to believe, that Canada welcomed us, that this was voluntary. It wasn't voluntary, not even close. My unit was assigned to a resource extraction zone near Penticton, a small town in the Okanagan Valley, population around 8,000, mostly families who'd lived there for generations. Farmers, teachers, shop owners, Regular people who woke up one morning to find American soldiers occupying their town and American corporations strip mining their land. The locals tried peaceful protest at first. They'd gather in the town square with signs, singing their national anthem, waving those maple leaf flags. Our commander, a career officer named Morrison, told us to disperse them. When they refused, he ordered us to use force. I watched my squad mates crack skulls with rifle butts, drag screaming mothers away from their children, arrest anyone who looked like a leader. That was September 2069, 3 months into my deployment, and I'd already learned that peacekeeping meant beating down anyone who resisted American interests. But Penticton got worse. The mining operations were destroying the local water supply, chemicals leaching into the groundwater, making people sick. When a group of citizens blockaded the highway with tractors and their own bodies, demanding the company shut down until the contamination was fixed, Morrison didn't negotiate. He didn't even try to arrest them. He called in an artillery strike. I was 19 clicks away when it happened, but I heard the shells. 3 rounds of high explosive ordnance, followed by 2 white phosphorus. When we arrived to secure the area, there was nothing left but craters and smoke. 200 civilians evaporated because they dared to protect their own land. The official report called it an insurgent stronghold, said we'd neutralized a terrorist cell planning to sabotage American infrastructure. I threw up behind a burned-out tractor. My squad leader told me to grow a spine or transfer to supply duty, said this was war, and war required hard men making hard choices. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there was a reason, a purpose, something that made it necessary. But I couldn't stop thinking about the math. 200 people dead to protect a mining operation that would be depleted and abandoned within 5 years. That's when I started to understand. This wasn't about security. It wasn't about protecting anyone. This was about taking everything we could before the world ran out of resources, and we didn't care who we had to kill to do it. The official annexation began on June 3rd, 2072. I'd been in Canada almost 3 years by then, transferred from British Columbia to Ontario after Morrison's unit got reassigned to the Yukon. The announcement came from Commander Buzz Babcock himself, standing in front of cameras in Ottawa with the American flag behind him. He cited the attempted sabotage of the Alaskan pipeline as justification, called it a matter of national security. They'd been waiting for that excuse. The pipeline incident was almost certainly staged by our own intelligence operatives, but Babcock used it to declare complete military takeover of all Canadian assets and resources. He actually called Canada Little America during the speech. Not as a joke, as official policy, American troops spread across the country like a virus after that. 3-pronged invasion from British Columbia eastward, from the Midwest through the prairies, from New England into Ontario and Quebec. We crushed the Canadian armed forces in weeks. They tried to form guerrilla units in the wilderness, small teams using their knowledge of the terrain to hit our supply lines and retreat into the forests. We hunted them like animals. Power armor made it easy. The new T-45 models had just been deployed to our units, and we were unstoppable. We'd crash through their camps at dawn, sensors picking up heat signatures through the trees, incinerating anyone who moved before they could even wake up. I personally participated in 17 raids during the summer of 2072. 17 camps full of Canadian soldiers trying to defend their homeland, wiped out in minutes. One raid stands out: Northern Ontario, near Timmins. Intelligence said we'd find a resistance cell operating from an abandoned lumber camp. We went in hard, full assault protocol. But when we breached the main building, it wasn't soldiers, it was families. Women, children, elderly people who'd fled the cities when the occupation began, hiding in the wilderness, hoping to wait out the war. Our orders were no witnesses. Secure the area. Eliminate potential insurgents. Those were the exact words. Eliminate potential insurgents. I watched my Brothers in arms systematically execute 43 people that morning. Grandmothers who could barely walk. Children young enough they probably didn't even understand what America was. Shot in the back of the head and dumped in a mass grave, we forced the surviving men to dig before we shot them too. I didn't pull the trigger that day, but I didn't stop it either. I stood there in my power armor, listening to the gunshots and the screaming, telling myself I was following orders, telling myself this was necessary for the mission, telling myself I was protecting American lives by ending Canadian ones. That's the lie they train into you, that following orders absolves you of responsibility, that the chain of command shoulders the moral weight so you don't have to. But standing in that lumber camp, watching steam rise from cooling bodies in the morning frost, I knew the truth. Every single one of us was guilty. Every single one of us chose to pull those triggers, chose to follow those orders, chose to believe that American supremacy justified any atrocity. They filmed some of it, the executions. Not the massacre at Timmins, but other operations. Montreal, Quebec City, Vancouver. They'd set up cameras and record us executing Canadian resistance fighters, then broadcast the footage back home on Galaxy News Network. Our dedicated boys keep the peace in newly annexed Canada. That's what the announcer would say while you watched soldiers in power armor blow someone's brains out on national television. The footage was meant to show American resolve, meant to demonstrate that we were serious about maintaining order. And it worked. For a while, support for the annexation ran high. People saw us executing what they called terrorists and felt safer, felt like their government was protecting them from chaos and violence. But some of that footage leaked, unedited versions showing the context the propaganda machine cut out, showing that the terrorists were teachers and farmers and teenagers with improvised weapons trying to defend their homes. Pictures of atrocities started making their way across the border. Images of mass graves, burned villages, execution pits. The American public started to turn. Protests erupted in major cities back home, people marching against the occupation, demanding withdrawal, calling it a war crime. The government's response was to deploy power armor units domestically for the first time. Soldiers who'd been fighting in China and Canada suddenly found themselves fighting Americans in the streets of Detroit and Chicago. Food riots were already common by 2075. Add political unrest to the mix, and you had what looked like the early stages of civil war. Several soldiers defected during this period. Guys who'd served in Canada and couldn't stomach what we'd become. They tried to go public with testimonies about what we'd done up there. Every single one was captured and sent to military prisons to die. The official story was they were collaborating with enemy forces. The truth was the government couldn't afford to let them talk. I thought about defecting every day from 2074 until the bombs fell. I thought about it, gathering evidence, smuggling out documentation, finding a way to expose the truth. But I was a coward. I kept my head down, followed orders, and collected my pay. By January 2076, the annexation was officially complete. Canada ceased to exist as a nation. The provinces became United States territories, but not states, not even commonwealths, just occupied zones under military control. Western territories, Eastern territories, Northern operations. We carved up an entire country and renamed the pieces like we were reorganizing a filing system. Canadian protesters and rioters were shot on sight by then. Official policy: if you gathered in groups of more than 5 people, if you displayed a Canadian flag, if you spoke out against American occupation in any way, you were designated an enemy combatant and terminated. I personally executed 11 people in Montreal over the course of one afternoon in March 2076. All of them had been holding anti-American signs. All of them were unarmed. The resistance kept fighting, though. Even as the war with China escalated, even as resources grew scarcer, Even as it became clear that global nuclear war was inevitable, Canadian freedom fighters continued trying to reclaim their country. They knew it was hopeless. They knew we'd destroyed their nation beyond repair. But they fought anyway, because some things matter more than survival. I found a family hiding in a barn outside Winnipeg in August 2076. Parents and 3 children. Youngest couldn't have been more than 6. They'd been living there for months, scavenging food from abandoned farms, trying to stay invisible. Someone reported suspicious activity in the area, so my squad was sent to investigate. The father stepped out first, hands raised, begging us not to hurt his kids. He explained they weren't resistance, weren't political, just trying to survive until things got better. My commanding officer didn't care. His exact words were, "Canadian citizens are acceptable collateral damage. Secure the area." I was 29 years old. I'd been in Canada for 7 years. I'd participated in massacres, executions, operations so brutal they don't have names beyond classified designations. I'd watched my country commit genocide and called it liberation. And standing in that barn outside Winnipeg, looking at those 3 children huddled behind their mother, I finally had a choice that mattered. I could refuse the order. I could try to save them, even knowing it would probably get me court-martialed or shot. I could stand up and say, "No, this is wrong. I won't do this anymore." I could be the person I thought I was when I enlisted at 22, believing I was going to be a hero. I murdered them, all 5 of them, because my commanding officer said so, and because I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of disobedience. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. I buried them in the field behind the barn. Shallow graves because my CO wanted to move on quickly, said we were burning daylight. The mother's name was carved on a piece of wood near the barn entrance. Marie Rousseau. I don't know if that was actually her name or just something someone had written there before, but I memorized it anyway. Marie Rousseau and her family, murdered by an American soldier in August 2076, because they had the misfortune of being born north of the 49th parallel. The nightmares started after Winnipeg, not just about that family, though they featured prominently, about all of it. Every face I'd seen through my helmet's display before pulling a trigger, every voice begging for mercy in French or English, every child's scream cut short by gunfire. Sleep became impossible without drugs, and the military doctors handed out chems like candy by then, mentats to stay alert, psycho to suppress fear during operations, Med-X for the physical pain, anything to keep us functional. Some guys in my unit started keeping trophies, pieces of Canadian uniforms, identification papers, personal items taken from the dead. They'd trade them like baseball cards during downtime. I remember one corporal who had an entire collection of family photographs he'd stripped from corpses, organized by province. He said it helped him remember that he was making history, that future generations would understand the necessity of what we'd done. I wanted to kill him, not in combat, not following orders, just walk up behind him in the barracks and snap his neck. But I didn't, because by that point, I'd lost the capacity to tell the difference between justice and murder. Everything was violence. Every action was a crime. The only question was whether you'd be punished for it or promoted. The weapons manufacturing intensified after the annexation was complete. They converted the Long Branch arsenal in Ontario into American territory immediately, started producing rifles and ammunition stamped with USA Territory designations. I carried one of those rifles for 8 months, a modified service rifle chambered for 12.7mm rounds, powerful enough to punch through combat armor at close range. Some of our equipment came from factories that had been making Canadian military weapons just months before. We were literally using their own industry to arm ourselves for their suppression. The Alaskan pipeline swarms with American military units after January 2076. Thousands of soldiers transferred from occupation duty in the provinces to pipeline security Because even with Canada completely conquered, we were paranoid about sabotage. The pipeline was everything. Without it, the war effort in Alaska collapsed. Without Alaska, China won. Without victory against China, America's resource crisis became terminal. That's what they told us anyway. That we were fighting for survival, that the annexation of Canada was tragic but necessary, that history would vindicate our actions. But here's what nobody wanted to admit. The resources we extracted from Canada, the timber and minerals and freshwater, most of it didn't go to the war effort. It went to maintaining the lifestyle back home, keeping the lights on in American cities, keeping the cars running, keeping the illusion alive that everything was fine, that the old world would go on forever. We were strip mining an entire nation to delay the inevitable by a few more years. Quebec was the worst province for resistance activity. The French-Canadian population had always been more independent-minded, more protective of their culture and identity. When we occupied Montreal and Quebec City, they fought back with everything they had, not just military resistance, but civilian insurgency. Bombings, assassinations, sabotage operations that actually succeeded in disrupting our operations. The retaliation was systematic. We identified neighborhoods with high resistance activity, and we cleansed them. That's the word they used in the operational briefs. Cleansing. We'd cordon off entire city blocks, force the population out at gunpoint, then go building to building looking for weapons, resistance literature, anything that could justify arrests. If we found evidence of insurgent activity, we'd execute everyone in the building and burn it down. I participated in 4 cleansing operations in Montreal between March and July of 2076. The last one, we processed 732 civilians. Processed. That's military speak for decided who lives and who dies based on arbitrary criteria: age, health, perceived loyalty to American occupation. Old people and children were usually spared initially, though they rarely survived long after we destroyed their homes and killed their families. Young men were automatically suspect. Women depended on whether our intelligence officers thought they might be useful for labor or other purposes. I watched them sort people like livestock, this line for deportation to labor camps, this line for immediate execution, this line for interrogation, which usually meant torture followed by execution. The screaming echoed off the buildings, hundreds of voices in French and English begging for their lives, and we stood there in our power armor, impassive, following orders. One woman broke from the execution line and ran toward me. She was maybe 35, dark hair, matted with blood from where a soldier had struck her with a rifle. She dropped to her knees in front of me, grabbed my armored leg, and started speaking rapid French. I didn't understand most of it, but I caught a few words. Children, please, mercy. I looked down at her through my helmet display. The targeting reticle automatically highlighted her as a threat because she'd breached the security perimeter. My onboard computer was literally suggesting I neutralize her, and I almost did. My finger moved to the trigger on my laser rifle, but something in her eyes stopped me. Not hope, exactly. She knew she was going to die, but there was this desperate human connection, this moment where she looked at me and saw past the armor to the person inside and silently begged that person to remember what it meant to be human. I lowered my rifle and told her to get back in line. She didn't understand English, but she understood the gesture. She stood up, touched my armor where my chest would be, and walked back to die with the others. That moment haunts me more than the murders I actually committed, because in that instant, I had a chance to do something good, to save one person, and I sent her back to die anyway. I tell myself it wouldn't have mattered, that someone else would have shot her if I'd tried to help. But that's just another lie. I could have tried. I could have done something. Instead, I chose the easy path. Follow orders. "Stay safe. Let someone else pull the trigger." They executed her 6 minutes later. I watched it happen, made myself watch it happen, felt like the least I could do was bear witness. The Yukon front became one of the most active combat zones by late 2076. Canadian resistance forces had retreated into the wilderness there, using the brutal terrain and weather to their advantage. We sent in our best power armor units, veterans from the Chinese front who'd been fighting since the Anchorage operation began in 2067. They moved through the Yukon like a natural disaster, destroying everything in their path. I wasn't assigned to the Yukon, but I heard the stories. Entire resistance camps eliminated overnight. Villages burned to nothing because someone reported seeing Canadian flags. Summary executions broadcast over radio frequencies so other resistance cells would hear their comrades die. Psychological warfare designed to break the will to fight. It didn't work. The Canadian resistance kept operating right up until the bombs fell. Even when it was clear nuclear war was coming, even when Chinese forces were pushing hard in Asia and Alaska was barely holding, those fighters in the Yukon and scattered across the provinces kept trying to reclaim their country. They died for nothing in the end. The Great War made all of it meaningless. But maybe that's not true. Maybe dying for your home, for your identity, for the principle that your people deserve to exist, maybe that means something even when you lose, maybe especially when you lose. I started questioning orders openly in September 2076, not refusing, just asking why. Why this target? Why these civilians? Why now? My commanding officers didn't like it. I was called into a disciplinary meeting where a colonel I'd never met before explained that doubt was contagious, that my attitude was affecting unit morale, that I needed to remember my duty to my country. I asked him if genocide was my duty to my country. Used that exact word, genocide. His face went red, and he threatened me with court-martial for seditious speech. Said I was lucky he didn't have me arrested for treason. Then he transferred me to a punishment detail in the Eastern Territories. Guard duty at a labor camp outside the ruins of what used to be Ottawa. The camp held about 3,000 Canadian civilians. Men, women, teenagers, anyone the occupation government deemed potentially disloyal or useful for forced labor. They worked 16-hour shifts, processing salvage from destroyed buildings, sorting materials that would be shipped back to American factories. The conditions were designed to kill them slowly. Minimal food, no medical care, guards who beat them for entertainment. I spent 4 months at that camp, 4 months watching people waste away from starvation and disease. 4 months listening to them sing Canadian folk songs in the barracks at night, quiet, defiant voices keeping their culture alive even as their bodies failed. 4 months understanding that I was complicit in a crime so massive it didn't have adequate language to describe it. A teenager died in November, 17 years old, worked himself to death, hauling scrap metal in sub-zero temperatures. The camp commander wouldn't allow a funeral, said it would encourage rebellious sentiment, so the other prisoners sang for him anyway. This mournful French-Canadian song I didn't know, dozens of voices rising from the barracks in harmony. The guards wanted to punish them for it, but there were too many. You can't beat 3,000 people into silence. I stood there, listening to that song, and I understood that we'd lost. Not the war. The war we'd probably win eventually, or at least fight to mutual nuclear annihilation. But we'd lost something more fundamental. We'd lost any claim to being the good guys, to being defenders of freedom and democracy. We'd become exactly what we claimed to be fighting against: authoritarian, brutal, willing to commit any atrocity in pursuit of resources and power. The American dream died in Canada. We killed it ourselves. Christmas 2076 was the strangest day of my deployment. The camp commander declared a holiday cease work order, probably because he was drunk and feeling nostalgic. For one day, the prisoners weren't forced to labor. They huddled in their barracks, sharing whatever scraps of extra food they'd managed to hide, singing songs, telling stories about home before the occupation. Some of the younger guards thought it would be funny to mock them. They started singing twisted versions of "O Canada," changing the lyrics to insult and demean. I watched one prisoner, an old man who couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, stand up and very quietly begin singing the real version. His voice was weak and cracking, but he got through the first verse before a guard struck him down. The old man just got back up and kept singing, and then another prisoner joined him, and another. Within seconds, 3,000 voices were singing their national anthem in a labor camp on land that was officially American territory. The guards raised their weapons, ready to fire into the crowd, restore order through violence like we always did. But the camp commander stopped them. I don't know why. Maybe he was just too drunk to care. Maybe somewhere deep down he remembered that these were human beings, not animals. Maybe he realized that shooting 3,000 unarmed people on Christmas would be too much even for him. For whatever reason, he let them sing. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I'd ever heard. 3,000 people who'd lost everything, starving and freezing and dying, singing about a country that didn't exist anymore, refusing to let it be forgotten. I cried inside my helmet. First time I'd cried since Winnipeg. Not from sadness exactly, from shame, from the crushing weight of understanding what we'd done and knowing I'd been part of it. The camp commander saw me standing there, with moisture fogging my display. He pulled me aside after the singing stopped and told me I was getting soft, said I needed to toughen up or request transfer to supply duty where I wouldn't have to see the consequences of policy. I told him I wanted to see it, needed to see it. Someone had to remember these people as human beings instead of numbers in a casualty report. He transferred me back to active occupation duty in January 2077. Said I was too emotional for camp work. I was assigned to a power armor unit operating out of Toronto, conducting raids on suspected resistance cells in the surrounding territories. Back to hunting and killing, back to following orders. But something had changed. I started documenting things, keeping a journal hidden in my personal effects, recording details about operations, casualties, war crimes. I didn't have a plan for what to do with the information. Defection still seemed impossible, but I felt compelled to create a record to make sure someone, somewhere, knew the truth about what happened in Canada. Toronto was different than the other cities I'd served in. It had been one of Canada's largest urban centers before the annexation, and the occupation government had transformed it into a showcase of American dominance, renamed streets after American presidents, torn down monuments to Canadian history, and replaced them with statues of American military heroes, forced the surviving population to learn English exclusively, banned French and other languages in public spaces. They were trying to erase Canada from existence. Not just conquer it, but eliminate every trace that it had ever been a separate nation. In a generation, they thought, the children born in the territories wouldn't even know they were supposed to be Canadian. They'd grow up thinking of themselves as Americans who happened to live in the Northern Territories, no different than someone from Alaska or Montana. The resistance in Toronto focused on cultural preservation, underground schools teaching Canadian history, secret printing presses producing banned literature, networks smuggling out evidence of American atrocities to sympathetic journalists in neutral countries. They weren't trying to win militarily anymore. They were fighting to keep their identity alive. We hunted them viciously. Every week brought new raids on suspected underground schools, arrests of anyone caught with banned books, executions of people accused of spreading seditious ideas. The occupation government offered rewards for information, turning neighbor against neighbor, creating an atmosphere of paranoid surveillance. I participated in a raid on an underground school in March 2077. Intelligence said a group of former teachers were running classes for children in a basement beneath a destroyed apartment building. When we breached the location, we found 37 kids, youngest about 6, oldest maybe 14, sitting in a circle around an elderly woman reading from a history book. The book was about the War of 1812, when Canada fought off an American invasion and preserved its independence. The kind of history the occupation government had banned because it might inspire rebellious thoughts. The elderly woman was in the middle of describing how Canadian militia had burned Washington during that war when we crashed through the door. The children scattered, terrified, and the old woman calmly set down her book and raised her hands. My CO demanded to know who was running the operation, where the other teachers were hiding. She refused to answer, just looked at him with these calm, defiant eyes and stayed silent. He shot her, didn't hesitate, didn't threaten, just pulled his sidearm and executed a 70-year-old woman whose only crime was teaching children their own history. Then he ordered us to round up the kids for interrogation. I stood there, looking at her body, at the book that had fallen from her hands, at the children crying and screaming as my squad mates dragged them away. And I thought, this is what we've become. This is what America is now, a nation so terrified of losing its power that we murder grandmothers for teaching banned history. That night, I added detailed notes about the raid to my hidden journal. Names, dates, locations, everything I could remember. I didn't know what I was going to do with the information, but I knew that if I survived, if there was anything left after the war, someone needed to know what happened here. Someone needed to understand that Canada didn't just cease to exist. It was murdered deliberately, systematically, by us. The war with China escalated throughout early 2077. Anchorage was finally liberated in January after years of brutal combat. The Chinese forces were pushed back, their supply lines broken, their offensive collapsed. It should have been a victory. Instead, it felt like we just bought ourselves a few more months before the inevitable. Everyone knew nuclear war was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. Intelligence reports suggested China was preparing a massive strike. Our own government was running simulations on first strike scenarios. The whole world was balancing on the edge of annihilation, and we were still in Canada executing people for singing the wrong national anthem. In August 2077, 3 months before the bombs fell, I received new orders. My unit was being redeployed to help secure the Alaskan pipeline against potential Chinese sabotage. We were finally leaving Canada after 8 years of occupation, 8 years of atrocities, 8 years of crimes that would never be punished because the victors write history. The last operation I participated in was a raid on a resistance cell in the wilderness north of Toronto. Intelligence said they were planning an attack on a pipeline relay station. We went in at dawn with full power armor support, found 12 people in a makeshift camp, 7 men, 4 women, 1 teenage boy. They had hunting rifles and improvised explosives, hardly a threat to our hardened military positions. We were ordered to eliminate them all. No prisoners, no interrogation, just wipe them out and destroy any evidence they'd been there. Standard procedure by that point. I'd participated in dozens of identical operations, but this time, standing there with my laser rifle aimed at unarmed prisoners kneeling in the dirt, I hesitated. My CO noticed, demanded to know what the problem was. I told him I was done. I couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't keep following orders that violated every principle I thought America stood for. I was raised believing we were the defenders of freedom, that we fought tyranny, that we protected the innocent. Everything we'd done in Canada was the opposite of those values. He called me a traitor and a coward, said I'd be court-martialed for refusing orders. I took off my helmet and looked him in the eyes and told him that being called a traitor by someone who'd spent 8 years committing war crimes was a compliment, that history would judge all of us, and I wanted the record to show that at least one person said no. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. He pulled his own sidearm and aimed it at my head. Told me I had 10 seconds to pick up my weapon and carry out my orders, or he'd execute me for treason and desertion in a combat zone. The rest of my squad stood frozen, watching this confrontation, probably calculating whether they'd be punished for witnessing my rebellion. I looked at those 12 prisoners kneeling in the dirt, looked at the teenage boy, couldn't have been more than 16, tears streaming down his face. Looked at the resistance fighters who'd spent years hiding in the wilderness, surviving on scraps, fighting a war they knew they couldn't win because surrender meant the complete erasure of their identity. Then I looked back at my CO and I called his bluff, told him to pull the trigger, that I'd rather die than spend one more day murdering civilians for American imperialism, that whatever punishment he could inflict on me was nothing compared to living with what we'd already done. He didn't shoot me. I think he wanted to, but there were too many witnesses, and even in the middle of occupied Canada, executing your own soldiers required paperwork he didn't want to file. Instead, he pistol whipped me across the face, broke my nose, told me I was confined to quarters pending court-martial. Then he ordered the rest of the squad to proceed with the elimination order. They executed all 12 prisoners while I lay bleeding in the dirt. I heard every shot, counted them, 19 rounds total. Some of the resistance fighters didn't die from the first bullet. The teenage boy begged for his mother before they finished him. I memorized the sounds because I knew I'd never be allowed to forget them. My squad hauled me back to base and threw me in a holding cell. For 3 days, I sat there waiting for the court-martial, wondering if they'd just execute me quietly or make a show trial out of it. But on the 3rd day, the base commander came to my cell himself, told me that due to the escalating situation with China and manpower shortages, they were willing to overlook my insubordination if I agreed to immediate redeployment to Alaska. It was a deal. My silence about what happened in Canada in exchange for avoiding execution, accept the transfer, never speak about the war crimes, pretend the last 8 years were honorable service defending American interests. They'd even restore my rank and clear my record. All I had to do was shut up and soldier on. I took the deal. What else could I do? Refuse and get shot? At least in Alaska, I might have a chance to do something that actually mattered. Fight an enemy that was actually threatening American territory rather than murdering civilians for resources. They shipped me north in September 2077. The Anchorage front line was technically secure by then. Chinese forces pushed back beyond the Bering Strait, but everyone knew it was temporary. The war was entering its final phase. Either China would launch a desperate counteroffensive, or someone would deploy nuclear weapons. Probably both. Alaska was different than Canada. In Alaska, we were actually fighting soldiers, defending territory against a legitimate military threat. The Chinese forces we engaged were armed and trained and dangerous. There was something almost clean about it compared to what we'd been doing in the territories. When you kill someone shooting back at you, it's combat. When you kill someone begging for mercy, it's murder. But I couldn't shake Canada. Every time I looked at my power armor, I saw the faces of the people I'd killed wearing it. Every time I followed an order, I questioned whether it was lawful or just another atrocity dressed up as military necessity. The other soldiers thought I was shell-shocked, traumatized from combat. They didn't understand that I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of living, of surviving the war and having to face what I'd become. I started taking unnecessary risks, volunteering for the most dangerous patrols, exposing myself to enemy fire. Part of me wanted the Chinese to kill me, to solve the problem of my guilt with a bullet, but I kept surviving, kept fighting, kept adding to the body count. What do you do when you realize you're the villain in someone else's story? When you understand that everything you believed about yourself and your country was a lie? Some soldiers doubled down, convinced themselves even harder that what we'd done was necessary and righteous. Others broke down completely, substance abuse, and mental collapse. I just went numb, functioned on autopilot, did my job without thinking about it. The other soldiers in my Alaska unit talked about Canada sometimes. Most of them had served there at some point during the annexation. They'd trade stories about operations, laugh about close calls, reminisce about the easy days before the Chinese invasion when we were just suppressing poorly armed resistance fighters. One night in late September, a corporal from my new squad started bragging about a cleansing operation he'd participated in near Montreal, described in detail how they'd sorted civilians, how many they'd executed, made jokes about the screaming. He thought it was funny, thought it made him sound tough and experienced. I broke his jaw, didn't think about it, just stood up and hit him hard enough to shatter bone. Then I kept hitting him until 3 other soldiers pulled me off. They threw me in the stockade again, second time in a month. My commanding officer came down and asked me what the hell I thought I was doing, assaulting a fellow soldier without provocation. I told him it wasn't without provocation, told him that bragging about war crimes was provocation, that laughing about murdering civilians made you a psychopath who deserved worse than a broken jaw. The CO just stared at me for a long moment, then told me I needed to get my head straight or I was going to get myself killed. He was right, of course. I was spiraling, the guilt and rage and shame were eating me alive, and I was lashing out at anyone who reminded me of what I'd done, but I couldn't stop. Every time someone mentioned Canada, like it was just another deployment. Every time they treated the annexation as legitimate military action instead of genocide, I wanted to scream the truth at them. They transferred me again. 4th reassignment in 2 months. Sent me to a forward observation post near the coast where I'd have minimal contact with other personnel. Basically exiled me to a position where I couldn't cause problems. I spent October 2077 alone in a bunker, monitoring sensors, watching for Chinese naval activity that never came. The isolation gave me too much time to think, to remember, to catalog every face, every name, every life I'd helped destroy. I started writing more detailed journal entries, describing operations with clinical precision. If I was going to be haunted by these memories, I wanted them recorded accurately, wanted proof that it happened, that we did these things, that Canada didn't just disappear peacefully into American territory. I thought about Randall Clark sometimes, another soldier who'd served in Canada, who'd found the annexation sickening and criminal. His rifle ended up in Ontario, marked as USA territory, same as mine. But Clark survived the war, went on to become something better than what he'd been forced to be in Canada, became a protector instead of a killer. I didn't think I had that kind of redemption in me. I'd done too much, crossed too many lines. There's no coming back from executing a family in a barn, no path to absolution from gunning down protesters. The best I could hope for was to survive long enough to testify, to make sure the truth got out somehow. But then October 23rd happened. I was in the observation bunker when the sirens started. Emergency broadcast on all military frequencies. Nuclear launch detected. Chinese missiles inbound. Then American missiles launching in response. Then Soviet missiles. Then everyone's missiles. The whole world deciding in the space of 2 hours to commit collective suicide. I watched the radar display light up with incoming warheads, watched the defense systems try and fail to intercept them all, watched the first detonations bloom on the screen like flowers made of fire. Then the shockwaves hit Alaska, and my bunker lost power, and I sat in the dark, listening to the world end. The bunker was deep enough and reinforced enough that I survived the initial strikes. When I finally climbed out 3 days later, Alaska was gone. Everything was ash and radiation and ruins. The war was over. America had won. China had won. Everyone had won and lost simultaneously because there was nothing left to fight over. I wandered through the wasteland for weeks, my power armor protecting me from the worst of the radiation. Found other survivors, most of them dying from exposure or injuries. Tried to help when I could, but medical supplies were non-existent and I had no training beyond basic field medicine. Mostly, I just watched them die. You'd think the apocalypse would put things in perspective. That when the whole world burns, your personal guilt becomes meaningless. But it didn't work that way for me. If anything, the wasteland made it worse, because now Canada's destruction was complete, not just politically erased but physically annihilated. The people I'd helped kill were still dead, and now their entire nation was radioactive rubble. The annexation had achieved its ultimate goal. Canada truly didn't exist anymore. I made it to a settlement near the ruins of Anchorage in November. About 40 survivors, living in the remains of a military facility, sharing radiation meds and canned food, trying to figure out how to stay alive in the new world. They welcomed me because the power armor made me useful. I could venture into the hot zones, salvage supplies, defend against raiders and mutated wildlife. Nobody asked about my service record. Nobody cared about the war anymore. The old conflicts, the old nations, the old grievances, all of it was meaningless in the face of daily survival. But I cared. I couldn't let go of what I'd done just because the world had ended. I stayed with that settlement through the winter of 2077 into 78, learned how to survive in the wasteland, learned which water sources were clean enough to drink, which ruins were stable enough to scavenge, which mutated creatures to avoid, and which to hunt. Became good at it, actually. Turns out, the skills they'd trained into me for suppressing resistance fighters translated well to post-apocalyptic survival. One of the settlers was a former Canadian civilian named Thomas. He'd been living in Anchorage when the bombs fell, working for an American company after his family was killed during the annexation. When he found out I'd served in Canada, he wanted to know which operations, which provinces, whether I'd been near his hometown of Montreal. I told him the truth, told him about the cleansing operations, the labor camps, the executions. Told him about the family in Winnipeg and the school in Toronto and the resistance cell in the woods. Told him everything I documented in my journal, which I still carried despite the apocalypse making it meaningless. He listened to the whole confession without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me one question. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Absolution? Permission to feel better about what you did? I told him I didn't want anything, that I just needed someone to know, that if the story died with me, then those people died twice, once from bullets and once from being forgotten. Thomas thought about that for a while. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said that remembering doesn't make you a good person. Feeling guilty doesn't undo what you did. The only thing that matters now is what you do next. Are you going to use your skills and your armor to help people survive? Or are you going to wallow in guilt while the wasteland kills everyone around you? It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was a challenge, a chance to become something other than what I'd been. I spent the next few years trying to be useful, helped settlements defend against raiders, escorted supply caravans through dangerous territory, shared knowledge about pre-war technology and survival techniques, tried to protect people instead of killing them for a change. But Canada never left me. Every settlement I helped defend, I thought about the Canadian towns I destroyed. Every person I saved from raiders, I thought about the families I'd murdered. Every child I protected, I thought about the teenager who'd begged for his mother before my squad shot him. The wasteland was full of soldiers like me, veterans from both sides of the war, trying to survive in the world we'd destroyed. Most of them didn't talk about what they'd done before the bombs. There was an unspoken agreement that the old world's crimes stayed buried with the old world. We were all starting fresh, building new communities, new rules, new ways of living. But I couldn't start fresh. The ghosts wouldn't let me. I met another veteran in 2081, called himself Randall, though I never learned if that was his real name. He'd served in Canada too, hated what he'd been part of, carried the same guilt I did. We recognized it in each other immediately. That specific kind of shame that comes from committing atrocities under orders. We talked about it once, just once, sitting around a campfire while escorting a caravan. He told me that the annexation wasn't frightening, it was just sickening. The criminality of it. How we'd destroyed an entire nation and called it security. How we'd murdered civilians and called it peacekeeping. I asked him how he lived with it, how he got through each day knowing what he'd done. He said he didn't live with it. He just kept moving, kept helping people when he could, kept his own survival skills sharp so he'd be useful when others needed him. He said guilt was a luxury in the wasteland. You either functioned or you died, and dying was the easy way out. We parted ways after that caravan run. I never saw him again. But I thought about his words often, about how guilt was a luxury, how the only thing that mattered was what you did next. It helped, in a way. Didn't make the nightmares stop, didn't erase the memories, but it gave me a framework for continuing to exist. By 2085, I'd helped establish 3 different settlements, taught them defense strategies, showed them how to identify radiation hotspots, shared pre-war knowledge about water purification and crop rotation. I was useful. I was helping people survive. It should have felt like redemption, but every time someone thanked me for saving their life or defending their home, I thought about how many lives I'd taken, how many homes I'd destroyed. The math didn't balance. It never would. I could save 1,000 people and it wouldn't bring back the family from Winnipeg. I could defend 100 settlements and it wouldn't undo the cleansing operations in Montreal. What thought crosses your mind when you see someone in power armor now? Do you see a protector, a symbol of pre-war military might? Or do you see an instrument of oppression, a reminder of what that armor was used for? Because I've been both. I've used power armor to commit genocide, and I've used it to defend the innocent. Same armor, same weapons, different choices. The Brotherhood of Steel started appearing in the wasteland around 2084. Military remnants who'd seized technology and established themselves as a new faction. They talked a lot about preserving pre-war knowledge, about using technology responsibly, about learning from the mistakes that led to the apocalypse. I avoided them. They represented everything I hated about the old military culture, the rigid hierarchy, the belief that might makes right, the obsession with weapons and power. They thought they were better than the pre-war military, thought they'd learned the lessons, but they were still using violence to enforce their vision of order. Some of the settlements I'd helped asked me to join the Brotherhood, said my combat experience and power armor made me valuable to them. I refused every time, told them I was done with organizations that used military force to achieve their goals, that I'd followed orders for 8 years in Canada and I'd never follow orders again. A few of them understood. Most thought I was crazy for turning down the security and resources the Brotherhood offered, but I couldn't do it. Couldn't put myself back in that structure where someone else's commands overrode my conscience. I'd rather die alone in the wasteland than risk becoming complicit in more atrocities. The years blurred together after that. 2086, 87, 88. I kept moving, kept helping settlements, kept carrying my guilt like a second skin. The journal stayed with me, pages yellowing and fragile, but the words still legible. A record of crimes that nobody cared about anymore because the perpetrators and victims were all dead or scattered across the wasteland. I thought about burning it sometimes, just destroying the evidence, letting the past stay buried. But I couldn't. Those people in Canada deserved to be remembered, even if only by the person who'd helped kill them. Marie Rousseau and her family, the old woman teaching band history, the teenage boy crying for his mother, all of them deserved more than being forgotten in the radioactive wasteland. In 2090, I met a scribe from the Brotherhood who was researching pre-war history. She'd heard rumors about my journal, about detailed records of the Canadian annexation. She wanted to copy it, preserve the information in the Brotherhood's archives, said it was Important to document what the old world had done, to learn from our mistakes. I asked her what they'd do with the information. Would they publicize it? Would they make sure people knew what America had done to Canada? Or would they just file it away in some vault, another piece of data in their collection of pre-war knowledge? She admitted it would probably just be archived, that most Brotherhood members didn't care about old world politics, that the information wouldn't change anything for survivors trying to live in the wasteland. But she thought it mattered anyway. That truth mattered, even when it couldn't change the present. I gave her the journal, made her promise to preserve every word exactly as written. She took it back to her chapter, and I never saw it again. Maybe it's still in some Brotherhood archive somewhere. Maybe it was lost when their chapter was destroyed by raiders or super mutants or one of the other threats in the wasteland. I don't know. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt like maybe the truth had a chance of surviving me. The wasteland kept changing. New factions rose and fell. Raiders became warlords. Warlords became slavers. Slavers got wiped out by vengeful settlers. The cycle of violence continued, same as it always had, just with different flags and different justifications. Human nature survived the apocalypse intact. I got older, slower. The power armor that had made me unstoppable started needing more repairs than I could manage with scavenged parts. My body accumulated radiation damage and old combat injuries. By 2095, I was effectively retired from the fighting life, settling in with a community that valued my knowledge more than my combat skills. Thomas found me again in 2097. He'd been traveling the wasteland for years, trying to find other Canadian survivors, preserving what stories and memories he could. When he learned I was still alive, he tracked me down, said he had questions about the journal, about specific events I'd documented. We spent a week going through my memories, him asking questions, me answering as honestly as I could. He was building an oral history of the annexation, interviewing anyone who'd survived, trying to reconstruct what had been done to his country. It was painful reliving it all, but I owed him that much, owed all of them that much. At the end of the week, he asked me the same question he'd asked back in 2078. What do you want from this? Why keep confessing, keep remembering, keep torturing yourself with guilt? I told him I still didn't want anything, that guilt was just what I deserved, that the least I could do was remember their faces and carry the weight of what I'd done until I died. Thomas shook his head, said I still didn't understand, that the dead didn't need my guilt. They needed their story told. They needed witnesses who'd say, yes, this happened, Canada existed, and here's how it first was destroyed. Guilt was selfish. Testimony was service. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. That conversation changed something in me. Not redemption, exactly. Not absolution, but a shift in perspective. I'd been treating my guilt as punishment I deserved, a burden I had to carry alone. Thomas helped me understand that bearing witness was different than wallowing, that documenting atrocities served the dead better than flagellating myself with memories. I started actively seeking out other veterans after that, not to confess, but to collect testimonies, to build a comprehensive record of what happened during the annexation. I found former soldiers who'd served in every province, participated in every major operation. Some refused to talk. Others were eager to unload their guilt on someone who'd understand. A former corporal from the Western Territories told me about cleansing operations in Vancouver that killed over 2,000 civilians in a single week. A lieutenant who'd served in the Yukon described hunting resistance fighters through the wilderness, tracking them for days before ambushing their camps. A sergeant from Ontario admitted to personally executing 43 Canadian prisoners over the course of the occupation. Each testimony added another layer to the historical record. Each confession represented lives taken, families destroyed, communities erased. I documented everything, created an archive that would survive me, made sure the Brotherhood scribe got copies of every interview, every piece of evidence, every first-hand account. The work gave me purpose. For the first time since Winnipeg, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, not fighting, not surviving, but preserving truth, making sure that when future generations looked back at the annexation, they'd have more than propaganda and official histories. They'd have the voices of people who were there, who saw what really happened. I tracked down a former camp guard in 2098. He'd served at the same labor camp outside Ottawa where I'd done my punishment detail. He remembered the Christmas when 3,000 prisoners sang "O Canada," remembered the camp commander letting them finish despite standing orders to suppress any display of Canadian nationalism. He told me something I hadn't known, that after we left, after the guards rotated out and new personnel arrived, the camp commander was court-martialed for dereliction of duty, specifically for allowing that Christmas singing. He was stripped of rank and sent to a disciplinary unit on the Chinese front, died there in early 2077, killed in action 3 months after being transferred. The guards said the commander's name was Patterson, Major Robert Patterson. I wrote it down, added it to the archive. A man who'd spent years running a brutal labor camp, complicit in countless deaths, but who'd shown one moment of humanity on Christmas and paid for it with his career and eventually his life. The complexity of it troubled me. Patterson wasn't a hero, but he wasn't just a monster either. That's the thing about atrocities. They're committed by regular people, by soldiers following orders, and officers advancing careers, and politicians making pragmatic decisions. Evil doesn't require cartoon villains. It just requires ordinary people choosing expedience over conscience, choosing to follow orders rather than face consequences. I met a former Canadian resistance fighter in 3001. She'd been 17 when the annexation began, 24 when the bombs fell, spent those 7 years fighting American occupation in Quebec, survived through combination of luck and skill. When I told her I'd served in the occupying forces, participated in cleansing operations in Montreal, she just stared at me for a long moment. Then she asked which operations, which dates, which neighborhoods. I told her everything I remembered, described the tactics we'd used, the targeting criteria, the execution protocols. She listened without emotion, taking notes, comparing my account to her own memories. After I finished, she told me that one of the cleansing operations I'd participated in, March 6, 2076, had killed her entire family. Parents, 2 sisters, grandparents. She'd been away on a mission when we hit her neighborhood, came back to find everyone dead and her home burned to rubble. I waited for her to pull a weapon, to attack me, to demand some kind of justice. Instead, she just thanked me for the information. Said she'd spent 25 years not knowing exactly how they died, imagining scenarios, torturing herself with possibilities. Now she knew. It didn't bring them back, but it gave her closure. She asked if I remembered them specifically. I didn't. We'd processed over 700 people that day. I couldn't recall individual faces from the execution lines. She showed me a pre-war photograph, her family smiling at some celebration. I studied it, trying to find them in my memories, but there was nothing. They'd been anonymous victims to me. Numbers in a report that hurt worse than if she'd attacked me. The fact that I'd participated in killing her family and didn't even remember them as individuals. They'd been real people with names and histories and relationships, and I'd helped erase them without even noticing, just following orders, just doing my job. She could see the guilt on my face, told me that dwelling on it was pointless, that I couldn't bring them back with remorse, but I could help her build the memorial she was creating, a record of everyone killed during the annexation, every name she could verify, every family story she could preserve. She wanted the Canadian dead to be remembered as people, not statistics. I worked with her for 2 years, helped cross-reference my military records with her civilian accounts. identified victims by matching dates and locations, built a database of names, ages, circumstances of death. It was meticulous, painful work. Every entry represented lives I'd helped destroy. The memorial grew to over 40,000 confirmed names, and that was just Quebec. The true death toll across all the provinces was probably 10 times higher, maybe more. We'd killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed an entire nation, and most of them didn't even have graves. Just scattered remains in mass burial sites or ashes scattered by the nuclear wind. I started having different nightmares after working on the memorial. Instead of seeing generic faces of victims, I'd dream about specific people from the database: Marie Rousseau and her 3 children, the elderly teacher shot for reading banned history, the teenage boy from that last operation before my transfer to Alaska. All of them with names now, with stories, with families who mourned them. But I also dreamed about the soldiers, the ones I'd served with who died in the Great War or in the wasteland afterward. My CO, who'd threatened to execute me for refusing orders, the corporal whose jaw I'd broken, the camp commander who'd let prisoners sing and paid for it with his career. They were victims too, in a way, broken by a system that demanded atrocities and punished conscience. That thought troubled me. I didn't want to create moral equivalence between the occupiers and the occupied. We'd chosen to follow orders. The Canadians had chosen to resist genocide. Those aren't morally equivalent positions. But I also couldn't ignore the complexity. Some of us had questioned, some had resisted, some had broken under the weight of what we were ordered to do. The woman I worked with on the memorial, her name was Gabrielle, understood this complexity. She'd killed American soldiers during her resistance work, ambushed patrols, planted explosives, executed collaborators. She had blood on her hands, too, even if her cause was just. She told me that violence corrupts everyone it touches, even when it's necessary, even when it's righteous. We became friends, in a strange way. 2 people from opposite sides of an extinct conflict, working together to preserve the memory of what had been lost. She never forgave me for serving in the occupation, but she recognized that I was trying to do something meaningful with what remained of my life. In 3003, Gabrielle died. Radiation sickness finally caught up with her after decades of exposure in the wasteland. She'd known for years it was coming, had been racing against time to finish the memorial before her body gave out. In her final weeks, she made me promise to continue the work, to keep documenting, keep preserving, keep making sure Canada wasn't forgotten. I buried her near the ruins of Montreal in soil that had been Canadian once, marked the grave with a cairn of stones. Didn't say any prayers because neither of us believed in that. Just stood there for a while, thinking about everything she'd survived and everything she'd lost. Then I went back to work on the memorial. The Brotherhood scribe found me again in 3005. She'd been promoted to head archivist for her chapter, wanted to update the records with everything I'd collected since giving her my journal. I turned over copies of all the interviews, all the memorial data, all the documentation Gabrielle and I had compiled. She told me the Brotherhood was using the information to teach younger members about pre-war governance failures, about how resource scarcity led to atrocities, how military power corrupted democratic institutions, how the pursuit of security became justification for genocide. She said my testimony was helping prevent the Brotherhood from repeating those mistakes. I wasn't sure I believed her. The Brotherhood still used military force to achieve their goals, still hoarded technology and power, still maintained rigid hierarchies that discouraged questioning orders. But maybe having access to the truth helped some. Maybe knowing what the old world had done wrong was better than ignorance. She asked me a question before she left, asked if I'd ever figured out why I survived the war when so many others died. If I thought there was a purpose to my survival, a reason I was still alive, almost 30 years after the bombs fell. I told her the truth. that I'd spent decades wishing I'd died in Canada or Alaska or the nuclear fire. That survival felt like punishment, like being forced to live with the weight of my crimes. But that somewhere along the way, it had become obligation. I survived so I could testify, so someone would remember what happened and why it was wrong. The scribe nodded. Said that sounded like the closest thing to redemption most of us could hope for in the wasteland. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the chance to make our remaining time count for something. After she left, I sat alone with my thoughts for a long time. Thought about Patterson letting the prisoners sing, about Gabrielle preserving her people's memory, about Randall Clark protecting children in Zion Canyon, about Thomas asking what I'd do next, about all the moments where people chose conscience over convenience, humanity over expedience. Those moments didn't erase the atrocities, didn't balance the scales or justify the occupation, but they mattered anyway. They proved that even in the worst circumstances, even when the system demanded inhumanity, individuals could still choose differently. We weren't automatons. We had agency, which meant we bore responsibility for our choices. I made my choice in that barn outside Winnipeg. I chose wrong. Chose to murder a family rather than face consequences for disobedience. Every day since, I've had to live with that choice. Has it made me better? I don't know. Has it served some purpose? Maybe. The memorial exists. The testimonies are preserved. The truth survived me, at least in some archives. But Marie Rousseau is still dead. Her children are still dead. The thousands of names in the memorial are still dead. No amount of documentation or testimony or guilt brings them back. The best I can offer is witness. Yes, this happened. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, I was part of it. By 3008, my body was failing. Decades of radiation exposure, old combat injuries, the simple wear of aging in the harsh wasteland environment. I could feel my time running out. Started making arrangements for what would happen to the memorial after I died. Made sure multiple copies existed, that the Brotherhood had everything, that Thomas knew where to find the backups. I thought about my identity for the first time in years. Who I'd been before the war. The name my parents gave me. The person I'd thought I was going to be when I enlisted at 22. That version of me died in Canada. The person who survived was someone different. Someone defined by guilt and testimony, and the choice to remember rather than forget. But I'm still that soldier from the Fallout intro, the one standing behind a kneeling prisoner, watching my comrade execute them, waving at the camera when we were noticed. That footage played on screens across America, propaganda showing our boys keeping the peace in newly annexed Canada. I was part of that, part of the machine that sold genocide as security. You want to know my name? You want to know which soldier I was? Which unit? Which operations? Does it matter? There were thousands of us, thousands of American soldiers who participated in the annexation. We all wore the same armor, followed the same orders, committed the same crimes. Naming me doesn't change what happened, but I'll tell you anyway, because testimony requires specificity, because anonymous confession is cowardice, because if I'm asking you to know the truth, I owe you my identity. My name is Michael Chen, serial number 728495. I served in the United States Army from 2069 to 2077. I participated in the illegal occupation and annexation of Canada. I committed war crimes. I murdered civilians. I followed orders that violated every principle America claimed to stand for. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not offering excuses. I'm just telling you what happened so someone knows. So when you see power armor in the wasteland, when you meet Brotherhood soldiers or Enclave remnants or any of the other factions built on pre-war military culture, you'll remember what that culture produced, what it was capable of, what it did. The annexation of Canada wasn't an aberration. It was American foreign policy taken to its logical conclusion. When you build an empire on military supremacy and resource extraction, when you teach your soldiers that following orders absolves them of moral responsibility, when you wrap atrocities in patriotic language and broadcast them as victories, you create the conditions for genocide. We destroyed Canada, deliberately, systematically, with full knowledge of what we were doing. And then we destroyed the world in nuclear fire because we couldn't imagine any other solution to our problems. Violence was all we knew, all we'd been trained for, all our institutions were designed to produce. I'm dying now. The radiation sickness that got Gabrielle is getting me too. I've got maybe weeks left. I'm making this final testimony, this last confession, because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know that Canada didn't just disappear, that the annexation wasn't peaceful integration, that the official histories are lies. They were a nation. They had culture, identity, history spanning back centuries. They were our neighbors, our allies, our friends, and we murdered them for timber and oil and strategic positioning. We erased them from maps and consciousness. We made their children forget. They were supposed to be Canadian. But I remember. Thomas remembers. Gabrielle remembered until she died. The memorial remembers. And now you remember too. That's all I can offer. Memory, testimony, truth about what was done and who did it and why it was unforgivable. If you're listening to this, if you've made it through my confession, then you know now. You know what America did to Canada. You know what power armor was used for before it became a symbol of wasteland authority. You know that the old world didn't just end in nuclear fire. It ended long before that, when we chose resources over humanity, when we chose to follow orders over conscience. Learn from it, don't repeat it. When someone tells you that violence is necessary for security, remember Canada. When someone says following orders absolves responsibility, remember the soldiers who executed families and teachers and teenagers. When someone wraps atrocity in patriotic language, remember that we called genocide, annexation, and made it sound noble. The wasteland gives us a chance to build something different, something that doesn't require mass graves and cleansing operations, something that values human life over territory and resources. We failed in the old world. We failed catastrophically, but we can choose differently now. I chose to testify, to remember, to preserve the truth. It doesn't redeem me, doesn't erase my crimes, but it's what I could do with the time I had left. It's my answer to Thomas's question. What are you going to do next? I'm leaving the memorial to the Brotherhood, all the names, all the testimonies, all the evidence. It'll sit in their archives alongside tactical manuals and technical specifications. Maybe someone will read it someday. Maybe they'll understand what we lost when we destroyed Canada. Maybe it'll make a difference. Or maybe it won't. Maybe the wasteland will grind on, factions fighting over scraps, violence begetting violence, the cycle continuing forever. Maybe human nature is too broken to build anything better. Maybe we're doomed to repeat history because we can't imagine alternatives to domination and exploitation. But I have to believe it matters. That truth matters. That memory matters. That preserving the stories of the dead serves some purpose beyond my own guilt. Because if it doesn't matter, if all of this was meaningless, then Marie Rousseau died for nothing, and her story dies with her, and the annexation becomes just another footnote in the long history of forgotten atrocities. So I'm leaving this recording, my final testimony, everything I remember about what we did to Canada and why it was unforgivable. I'm leaving it for whoever finds it, whoever listens, whoever cares enough to remember. My name is Michael Chen. I wore the stars and stripes on my power armor when I executed civilians in Vancouver. The history books called it annexation. I was there. It was genocide, and I participated willingly because I was too much of a coward to refuse. That's my confession. That's my testimony. That's the truth about America's most covered-up war crime. Remember it, remember them, and do better than we did.